The papers crackled in the cold, and Vara Stonehand watched a stranger's gloved fingers trace the line where her name sat in iron-sharp ink. Dawn had not broken yet. The sky hung gray and heavy above the valley estate, the kind of gray that swallowed sound and made breath steam white in the still air. She stood between two men who spoke over her head as though she were a plow horse or a sack of seed grain, her contract passing from one hand to another as it had every autumn for the past 6 years. The labor holder, a narrow-shouldered man named Grant, smelled of pipe smoke and wet wool. He never looked at her directly, only at the coin purse that changed hands, counting with quick, practiced fingers. The other man was new. Vara had heard the whispers in the workers' barracks 2 weeks prior. The old master had died, and his nephew had come from somewhere east to inherit the valley estate. She expected someone loud, someone who would swagger and make demands, someone who would treat her as the old master had, with distant indifference punctuated by sharp orders. Instead, this man stood quietly in the pre-dawn cold, his dark coat buttoned high against the chill, his face hard to read in the dim light. He was tall but not unusually so, perhaps 30 years old, with brown hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed tired even in the half-light. Xander Carrick, they called him. He had arrived at the estate 3 months ago, just as summer turned toward harvest, and had spent those months walking the fields, learning the land, saying little. The workers did not know what to make of him. The old master had been predictable in his cruelty and his neglect. This one was a cipher. "Same terms as always," Grant was saying, his voice nasal and clipped. "Return her by first frost, sound of limb and able to work. Any damage, any loss of value, you pay the difference." Xander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Vara saw it because she had learned to watch men's faces for the small tells that meant danger or mercy. He said nothing, only nodded once, and Grant folded the coins into his belt pouch with a satisfied grunt. "Good doing business, Master Carrick. She is a hard worker, this one. You will get your money's worth." The labor holder turned and walked away into the gloom, his boots crunching on the gravel drive. Vara stood very still. She had learned stillness the way a rabbit learns to freeze when the hawk's shadow passes overhead. Around them, the estate began to wake. A lantern glowed in the kitchen window, smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney, and somewhere in the stables a horse whinnied softly. Xander finally looked at her. His eyes were gray, the color of the sky above them, and something in his expression made her stomach twist with uncertainty. It was not cruelty she saw there, nor indifference. It was something closer to sorrow, and that frightened her more than anger would have. "You must be cold," he said quietly. His voice was deeper than she expected, rough around the edges as though he had not spoken much that morning. "Come inside. We will talk after you have eaten." He turned and walked toward the main house without waiting to see if she followed. Vara hesitated, then moved after him, her boots heavy on the gravel. She wore the same clothes she wore every year when she came to the estate. A rough linen shirt that had been mended too many times to count, canvas trousers that were too large and belted with rope, and a wool vest that smelled faintly of the barracks where she had slept the night before. Her hair, dark as river stones and cropped short to keep it out of her way, was damp with morning dew. She was small for an orc, barely taller than most human women, with the green skin and small tusks that marked her kind, and she had learned to make herself smaller still, to take up as little space as possible. The kitchen was warm and bright, a sharp contrast to the cold outside. A fire crackled in the wide hearth, and the cook, a broad-hipped woman with flour on her apron, looked up in surprise as Xander entered with Vara trailing behind. "Master Carrick, the cook said, her eyes flicking to Vara with barely concealed curiosity. "I was not expecting you so early." "Set another place, Marta," Xander said, shrugging out of his coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "And make it a full meal. She has had a long night." The cook's eyebrows rose, but she said nothing, only turned back to her work. Xander gestured for Vara to sit at the long wooden table that dominated the center of the kitchen. She hesitated, then sat on the very edge of the bench, her hands folded in her lap. In 6 years of coming to this estate, she had never been invited inside the main house. She had slept in the workers' barracks, a drafty building near the fields, and eaten whatever scraps were brought out after the house staff had finished. This was wrong, all of it, and she did not understand what game was being played. Xander sat across from her, leaning back in his chair with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. He did not speak, and Vara did not know what to say, so they sat in silence while Marta moved about the kitchen, the clatter of pans and the hiss of frying eggs filling the space between them. Finally, the cook set 2 plates on the table, each piled with eggs, thick slices of bread, fried potatoes, and strips of bacon. Vara stared at the food as though it might vanish if she blinked. "Eat," Xander said, and there was no command in his voice, only a quiet statement of fact. She picked up the fork with fingers that trembled slightly and took a bite of the eggs. They were rich and buttery, seasoned with herbs she could not name, and for a moment she forgot everything else. Hunger was a constant companion, and food like this was a luxury she had not tasted in longer than she could remember. She ate slowly, carefully, aware of Xander's gaze on her but unwilling to look up and meet his eyes. When she had finished half the plate, she set the fork down and finally looked at him. He had barely touched his own food, and he was watching her with that same unreadable expression. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. "For the food." He nodded once, then pushed his plate aside and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I need to explain something to you, and I need you to listen. Can you do that?" Vara's stomach tightened. Here it was, then, the catch, the demand, the thing that would make sense of this strange kindness. She nodded, bracing herself. "I did not know about the contract system until I arrived here," Xander said, his voice low and measured. "My uncle never spoke of it in his letters. When I learned that people were being rented like tools, I knew I could not continue it. I will not." He paused, as though choosing his words carefully. "I am going to ride to Grent's holding this morning, and I am going to buy out your contract outright, not to own you, to end it. To tear it up and give you your freedom." Vara stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of the words. Freedom was not something that happened. Freedom was a story, a myth, something whispered about in the dark when the work was done and the overseers were asleep. It was not something a man offered across a kitchen table over breakfast. "I do not understand," she said slowly. "I am setting you free," Xander said, and there was a quiet intensity in his voice now. "You will not be bound to any contract. You will not be leased or sold or rented again. If you want to stay and work here, I will pay you fair wages, the same as any other worker. If you want to leave, I will give you enough coin to travel wherever you wish and a letter of safe passage. The choice is yours." She felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. It was not hope, not quite, because hope was too dangerous a thing to hold. It was closer to disbelief, tinged with the sharp edge of fear. "Why?" she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. Xander looked away, his gaze settling on the fire in the hearth. "Because it is wrong," he said simply. "Because you are not an ox or a piece of equipment. Because my uncle built his wealth on the backs of people who had no choice, and I will not do the same." He stood, picking up his coat from the peg and shrugging it back on. "I am leaving now. I will be back by midday. Marta will show you to a room where you can rest. When I return, we will talk more." He left before she could find words to respond, the door closing softly behind him. Vara sat frozen at the table, the remains of her breakfast growing cold in front of her. Marta moved about the kitchen, humming softly as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. "Come along then," the cook said after a moment, wiping her hands on her apron. "I will get you sorted." Vara followed her up a narrow staircase to the second floor of the house, where the servants' quarters were located. Marta opened a door to a small room with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the fields. It was plain and simple, but the bed had clean linens and the floor was swept, and it was warmer and drier than any place Vara had slept in years. "Rest if you can," Marta said, her voice gentler now. "Master Carrick means what he says, strange as it sounds. He is not like his uncle." She left, closing the door quietly behind her. Vara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking now that she was alone. She did not know what to do with the storm of emotions that churned inside her. Disbelief, fear, anger at the hope that was beginning to take root despite her best efforts to crush it. She had learned not to trust kindness, because kindness always came with strings attached, and those strings always tightened into nooses. But Xander had looked at her as though she were a person, not a tool. He had fed her and spoken to her as though her thoughts and choices mattered. And he had promised her freedom. She lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to imagine what freedom might look like. Xander returned just after noon, as promised. Vara had not slept, though she had lain on the bed for hours, her mind racing in circles. When Marta came to fetch her, she followed the cook back down to the kitchen, where Xander was sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a heavy leather satchel beside him. He looked up as she entered, and she saw the tension in his shoulders, the weariness in his eyes. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, perching on the edge of the bench as she had that morning. "It is done," he said quietly. He reached into the satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers, setting them on the table between them. Vara recognized the topmost document. It was her contract, the one that bound her to Grent's labor holding, the one that dictated the terms of her life. Xander picked it up and, without ceremony, tore it in half. Then he tore those halves into quarters, and those quarters into eighths, until the paper was nothing but confetti on the table. Vara's breath caught in her throat. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched one of the scraps, as though to confirm it was real. "You are free," Xander said, and his voice was firm now, leaving no room for doubt. "Grent has been paid in full. The contract is void. You owe no one anything." She looked up at him, and to her horror, she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had not cried in years, had taught herself to lock away any emotion that might be seen as weakness, but now the tears came unbidden, hot and fierce. She scrubbed at her face with the back of her hand, angry at herself, but they kept coming. Xander said nothing, only waited, his hands folded on the table in front of him. When she finally regained control, she looked at him and saw no judgment in his eyes, only patience. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Nothing," he said, "except an answer to a question." She waited, her heart pounding. "Will you stay?" he asked. Not as a bonded worker, not as someone under contract, as a hired hand paid fair wages with the freedom to leave whenever you choose. "The harvest is coming, and I need workers I can trust." "I think you are someone I can trust, but the choice is yours." Vara looked down at the scraps of paper on the table, the remains of the contract that had defined her life for so long. She thought about leaving, about taking the coin, and the letter of safe passage he had offered in walking away from this place, from the valley, from the memories of every harvest season spent in back-breaking labor with no say in her own fate. She thought about the world beyond the estate, a world she knew little about, where an orc woman with no family and no connections would be met with suspicion and hostility at best, violence at worst. And then she thought about the way Xander had looked at her that morning, as though she were a person worthy of respect. She thought about the food he had given her, the room with the clean bed, the quiet promise in his voice when he said the choice was hers. "I will stay," she said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. "For now," he nodded, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw the hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "That is all I ask." The harvest began in earnest the following week. Vara worked alongside the other hands, men and women who had been hired for the season, cutting wheat and binding it into sheaves, loading the wagons and hauling them to the threshing barn. The work was hard, as it always was, but there were differences now that she noticed with a kind of stunned wonder. Xander paid her wages at the end of each week, placing the coins in her hand and thanking her for her work. He made sure the workers had enough food and clean water, and he checked in with them regularly, asking if they needed anything, if the pace was manageable. He worked alongside them too, his sleeves rolled up and his hands blistered, and he did not ask anyone to do anything he was not willing to do himself. The other workers were wary of Vara at first. Orcs were not common in the valley, and those who were present were usually bonded laborers, treated with suspicion and kept at arm's length. But Vara kept her head down and did her work, and slowly, cautiously, a few of them began to speak to her. A young man named Tomas showed her a faster way to bind the sheaves. An older woman named Elsa shared her water flask on a particularly hot afternoon. Small kindnesses, but they mattered. Xander, though, was the one she found herself watching. He was quiet, always, speaking only when necessary, but his actions spoke louder than words. He noticed when someone was struggling and stepped in to help without making a show of it. He settled disputes between workers with calm fairness. He listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, people listened in return. Vara did not know what to make of him. She had known cruelty and she had known indifference, but she had never known someone who seemed genuinely committed to doing right by the people in his charge. It unsettled her, this goodness, because she did not know how to guard against it. Cruelty and indifference she could armor herself against, but kindness slipped past her defenses and left her vulnerable in ways she did not like. One evening, nearly a month into the harvest, she found him sitting on the porch of the main house, a cup of tea in his hands and his gaze on the fields that stretched out before them, golden and glowing in the late afternoon light. She had been on her way back to the workers' barracks, but something made her stop, made her hesitate at the bottom of the porch steps. "May I ask you something?" she said, and her voice startled him. He looked up, and after a moment he nodded and gestured to the empty chair beside him. She climbed the steps and sat, feeling awkward and out of place. The porch was wide and well kept, with potted plants on the railings and a view of the valley that was almost painfully beautiful. "What did you want to ask?" Xander said, his voice quiet. She struggled to find the words. "Why did you do it? Buy out my contract, I mean. You said it was because it was wrong, but people do wrong things all the time. Why did you care enough to stop it?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the fields. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something she could not quite name. "My uncle raised me after my parents died. I was 10 years old and he took me in, gave me a home, paid for my education. I thought I knew him. I thought he was a good man." He paused, his jaw tightening. "When I came here, I expected to find an estate that was run well, that treated its workers fairly, because that was the man I thought he was. Instead, I found a system built on exploitation, on people who had no choice and no voice. And I realized that I did not know him at all. He looked at her then, his gray eyes meeting hers. I could not undo what he had done. I could not bring back the years that you and others like you lost, but I could stop it from continuing. I could make sure that no one else would be rented out like livestock, at least not on land that I controlled. Vara felt something shift inside her, a softening she had not expected. It cost you a great deal, I think, buying out the contract. And you will make enemies if you try to change the whole system. I already have, Xander said with a faint, wry smile. The other landowners in the valley are not pleased. They have made that clear, but I do not care what they think. I care about what is right. She looked out at the fields, at the workers moving among the rows of wheat, at the sky turning pink and gold as the sun sank toward the horizon. I have never met anyone like you, she said quietly. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He asked, and there was a hint of humor in his voice. She considered the question. I do not know yet, he laughed, a low, genuine sound that surprised her. Fair enough. They sat in silence for a while, the evening settling around them like a blanket. It was comfortable, this silence, and Vara realized with a start that she felt safe here on this porch, beside this man. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, but she did not know how to stop it from growing. As the weeks passed and the harvest continued, Vara found herself drawn to Xander in ways she did not fully understand. She watched the way he moved through the world, with a quiet confidence that did not demand attention, but commanded respect nonetheless. She noticed the way he smiled at small things, like a well-tied sheaf or a job done right, and the way he listened when people spoke, as though their words truly mattered to him. She also noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not paying attention. It was not the look of someone assessing a tool or an asset. It was the look of someone seeing another person, fully and completely, and she did not know what to do with the way it made her feel. One afternoon, as they were loading the last wagon of the day, Xander called her over to where he stood near the barn. The other workers were finishing up, their voices a low murmur in the background, and the air smelled of hay and sun-warmed earth. I wanted to talk to you about something, he said, and there was a hesitance in his voice that was unusual for him. She waited, her stomach tightening with unease. There are 3 other workers on the estate who are under contract like you were, he said. They were hired by my uncle years ago, and their terms are not good. I want to buy out their contracts too, to give them the same choice I gave you. But it will take most of what is left in the estate's coffers, and it will make things difficult for a while. Tight. He looked at her, his gray eyes serious. I am telling you this because you are part of this place now, and you deserve to know. It might mean lower wages for everyone, at least for a season or 2, until we can rebuild. And it will definitely mean more trouble with the other landowners. They are already angry. This will make them angrier. Vara studied his face, seeing the tension there, the weight of the decision he had already made. You are asking for my opinion. I am, he said. You have more reason than anyone to understand what is at stake. She thought about the 3 workers he was talking about. She had seen them around the estate. A middle-aged orc man who worked in the stables, a young human woman who tended the kitchen garden, and an older orc woman who helped with the laundry. They all had the same haunted look she had once seen in her own reflection, the look of people who had learned not to hope for anything better. Do it, she said, and her voice was firm. Lower wages for a season or 2 I can manage, but they should have the same chance you gave me. They should have a choice. Xander let out a breath, and she realized he had been holding it, waiting for her answer. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Do not thank me," she said. "Just do it." He did. Within a week, he had ridden out to meet with the contract holders and returned with the same resolution he had brought for Vara. The contracts bought out, the papers torn up, the workers freed. The older orc woman, whose name was Masha, wept when he told her. The young human woman, Leela, stared at him in disbelief. The orc man, Torin, simply nodded and said, "I will stay if you will have me." They all stayed. And the estate, which had felt cold and lifeless when Xander first arrived, began to feel like something else, something warmer. Something that might, in time, be called a home. But freedom, as Vara was learning, came with its own challenges. The other landowners in the valley did not take kindly to what Xander was doing. They saw it as a threat to their own systems, a challenge to the way things had always been done. Rumors began to spread. That Xander was a fool, that he was soft, that he would run the estate into the ground within a year. Some of the neighboring estates stopped trading with him, refusing to sell him seed or equipment, and a few went so far as to turn away his workers when they came to town for supplies. Xander bore it all with a quiet, stubborn determination, but Vara could see the strain it put on him. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, and there were nights when she saw the light burning late in his study, where he pored over the estate's ledgers and tried to make the numbers work. One evening, she knocked on the door to his study and waited until he called for her to enter. He looked up from the desk, his face drawn and tired, and she felt a pang of something she could not quite name. "You should rest," she said. "You are going to work yourself into the ground." He smiled faintly. "I could say the same to you. You have been putting in longer hours than anyone." She shrugged. "I am used to hard work." "That does not mean you should have to do it all the time," he said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his eyes. "I am trying to make this place better, not just for me, but for everyone who works here. I do not want people to break themselves for this estate." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Then take your own advice and rest." He laughed, a short, tired sound. "I will when I can figure out how to keep us all fed and paid through the winter." She moved closer, looking at the ledgers spread out on the desk. The numbers meant little to her, but she could see the furrow in his brow, the tension in his shoulders. "You freed 4 people from contracts," she said quietly. "You gave them back their lives. That matters more than what the ledgers say." He looked up at her, and there was something raw in his expression, something vulnerable. "Does it? If I cannot keep this estate running, if I cannot provide for the people who stayed, then what good is freedom? They will be just as destitute, just as lost." She reached out, almost without thinking, and placed her hand over his where it rested on the desk. His skin was warm, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers. "You are doing the right thing," she said, and her voice was steady now, certain. "It is hard and it will get harder, but that does not mean it is wrong. We will figure it out, together." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart stutter in her chest. It was not gratitude, though there was that. It was something deeper, something that felt like recognition, like the moment when 2 people realize they are not alone. "Together," he repeated, and his hand turned under hers, his fingers curling around hers and holding tight. They stayed like that for a moment, the silence stretching between them, heavy with things unsaid. Then Vara pulled her hand away, her cheeks flushing green with embarrassment, and stepped back. "I should let you work," she said, her voice unsteady. "Vara," he said, and she paused at the door, looking back at him. "Thank you, for staying, for believing in this." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and left the room. That night, lying in her bed in the servants' quarters, she let herself admit the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Xander Carrick, and she had no idea what to do about it. The harvest came to an end in late autumn, as the first frost touched the fields and the air turned sharp and cold. It had been a good harvest, despite the challenges, and the barn was full of grain and the workers were paid in full. Xander stood in the middle of the threshing barn one evening, looking at the stacks of wheat and barley, and for the first time since Vara had met him, she saw him smile without reservation. "We did it," he said, turning to her. "We actually did it." She smiled back, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the physical labor of the past months. "We did." The workers celebrated that night with a feast in the barn, a tradition Xander had insisted on continuing despite the tight budget. There was roasted meat and fresh bread, ale and cider, and music from a fiddle player who lived in the nearby village. Vara sat beside Xander at one of the long tables, watching the others laugh and dance, and felt a contentment she had not known was possible. At some point in the evening, Xander leaned closer to her, his voice low so only she could hear. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" she asked, turning to look at him. "About what comes next," he said. "The harvest is done. The workers will leave soon, go back to their homes or move on to other jobs, but you have stayed, not because you had to, but because you chose to." She felt her heart begin to pound. "I have." "I want to ask you something," he said, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that made her breath catch. "But I do not want you to feel obligated. I do not want you to say yes because you think you owe me anything, because you do not. You owe me nothing." "Just ask," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a breath as though steadying himself. "Stay, not just for another season, but for as long as you want. This place, this estate, it is changing, and I want you to be part of that change, not as a worker, but as a partner. Someone who helps me build something better here." She stared at him, her mind reeling. "A partner, in every sense," he said, and his eyes searched hers. "I care about you, Vara, more than I should, maybe more than is wise, but I cannot help it. You are strong and brave and good, and I cannot imagine doing this without you. But if you do not feel the same, if you want to leave, I will understand. I will give you the coin and the letter of passage, and I will wish you well. The choice is yours. It always has been." She felt tears prick at her eyes again, and this time she did not try to stop them. "You are asking me to stay, as your partner." "I am," he said, and his voice was steady now, despite the fear she saw in his eyes. "If you will have me." She thought about the life she had lived before she came to this estate. The years of bondage and exploitation, the way she had been treated as less than human, less than a person. She thought about the moment Xander had torn up her contract, the way he had looked at her as though she mattered, as though her choices and her voice were important. She thought about the weeks they had spent working side by side, building something new and fragile and precious. "I will stay," she said, and the words felt like a vow. "Not because I owe you, but because I want to, because I care about you too, more than I thought I could care about anyone." His face lit up, and he reached for her hand, holding it gently in his. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I promise I will do everything I can to make sure you never regret this." She shook her head, squeezing his hand. "I know I will not." They sat together as the celebration continued around them, their hands clasped on the table, and Vara felt something settle inside her, something that felt like peace. Winter came to the valley, blanketing the fields in snow and bringing with it a quiet that was both restful and strange. The seasonal workers had left, but the core group remained. Marta in the kitchen, Torin in the stables, Masha in the laundry, Leela in the garden, and Vara, who had moved from the servants' quarters to a room on the second floor of the main house, closer to Xander's own chambers. It was a small change, but it felt significant, a marker of the shift in their relationship. Xander spent the winter months planning. He met with the workers who had stayed, asking for their input on how to improve the estate, what changes they wanted to see. He wrote letters to sympathetic contacts in other regions, seeking advice on how to run a farm without exploiting bonded labor. And he continued to push back against the other landowners in the valley, refusing to back down even when they threatened to cut off trade entirely. Vara found herself taking on more responsibilities as the weeks passed. She helped Xander with the planning, offering her perspective on what workers needed and what would make the estate a better place to live and work. She also began to take charge of some of the day-to-day operations, overseeing repairs to the barracks and organizing the supplies for the coming planting season. It was strange, having this much say in her own life, in the life of the estate, but it was also exhilarating. And through it all, her relationship with Xander deepened. They spent long evenings together in his study, talking about the future, about their hopes and fears, about the challenges they would face. They took walks through the snow-covered fields, their breath steaming in the cold air, and Vara learned to see the valley not as a place of bondage, but as a place of possibility. One evening in midwinter, as they sat by the fire in the main hall, Xander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. He held it for a moment, his expression nervous, then handed it to her. "What is this?" she asked, taking the box and turning it over in her hands. "Open it," he said quietly. She lifted the lid and found a ring inside, a simple band of silver with a small green stone set into it. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "It is not much," he said quickly. "I know it is not fancy or expensive, but I wanted to give you something that meant something. The stone is jade. It reminded me of you, strong and beautiful and rare." She felt her throat tighten. "Xander, I am not asking you to marry me," he said, holding up his hands. "Not yet. I know it is too soon, and I know you need time. But I wanted you to have this as a promise that I will always see you, always value you, always stand beside you. And when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will ask. But there is no rush, no pressure." She took the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the green stone catching the firelight and glowing softly. She looked up at him, and the emotion she saw in his face took her breath away. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking, "for seeing me, for giving me a choice, for everything." He reached for her hand, holding it gently, and they sat together by the fire, the winter wind howling outside, and Vara felt a happiness she had not known was possible. Spring came slowly to the valley, the snow melting in fits and starts, the ground thawing and turning to mud before it finally dried enough to plow. Xander hired new workers for the planting season, offering fair wages and clear terms, and word began to spread that the Carrick estate was a good place to work. People came from other regions, curious and hopeful, and the estate began to feel alive in a way it had not before. But with the growth came new challenges. The other landowners in the valley were growing more hostile, and there were rumors of sabotage, fences cut, equipment damaged, workers harassed in town. Xander dealt with it as best he could, but Vara could see the toll it was taking on him. He was sleeping less, worrying more, and there were days when she saw the doubt creeping into his eyes. One afternoon in late spring, as they were inspecting the newly planted fields, Vara turned to him and said, "You are not alone in this. You know that, right?" He looked at her, surprised. "I know." "Do you?" she pressed. "Because you keep trying to shoulder everything yourself as though you are the only one who cares about this place. But we all care, I care, and we are all in this together." He was silent for a moment, then let out a long breath. "I am scared," he admitted, his voice low. I am scared that I am going to fail, that I am going to let everyone down, that I am going to lose this place and all the people who depend on it will suffer because I was not strong enough or smart enough to make it work." She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You are strong enough, and you are smart enough, but you do not have to do it alone. Let us help. Let me help." He looked at her, and she saw the fear in his eyes begin to ease, replaced by something warmer. "I do not know what I did to deserve you," he said quietly. "You did not have to do anything," she said. "You just had to see me. And you did." They stood together in the middle of the field, the sun warm on their faces and the smell of freshly turned earth all around them, and Vara knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The trouble came in early summer, just as the crops were beginning to grow. A group of men from one of the neighboring estates arrived at the Carrick estate one afternoon, led by a tall, sharp-featured man named Darian Westcott. He was one of the most powerful landowners in the valley, and he had made no secret of his disdain for Xander's methods. Vara was in the barn when they arrived, helping Torin repair a broken wagon wheel, but she heard the commotion and hurried outside. Xander was standing in the yard, his arms crossed, facing Westcott and his men. The other workers had gathered as well, a silent, watchful crowd. "You are making fools of all of us, Carrick," Westcott was saying, his voice loud and angry. "This nonsense of freeing bonded workers and paying fair wages, it is going to ruin us all. You are setting a precedent that we cannot afford." "Then maybe it is time to change the way things are done," Xander said calmly. "Exploiting people is not a sustainable business model, Westcott. It is wrong and it is cruel." "Wrong," Westcott sneered. "You are a fool if you think the world works on morality. This is business. And if you keep this up, you are going to find yourself very isolated very quickly." "I am already isolated," Xander said. "You and the others have made sure of that, but I am not going to change what I am doing just because you do not like it." Westcott's face darkened. "Then you leave me no choice. I am calling in the debt your uncle owed me. 10,000 crowns due in full by the end of summer. If you cannot pay, I will take the estate." Vara felt her stomach drop. 10,000 crowns was an enormous sum, more than the estate could possibly generate in a single season. Xander's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "My uncle never mentioned a debt." "It is in the records," Westcott said, pulling a folded document from his coat and tossing it at Xander's feet. "Signed and witnessed. You inherited his estate, you inherited his debts. End of summer, Carrick. Pay up or get out." He turned and walked away, his men following, and the yard fell silent. Xander picked up the document and unfolded it, his hands trembling slightly. Vara moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. The debt was real, detailed, and documented, a loan taken out by his uncle years ago and never repaid. "This will ruin us," Xander said quietly, his voice hollow. "There is no way we can raise that kind of money in 3 months. Vara looked around at the workers who had gathered, at the people who had stayed because they believed in what Xander was trying to build. She saw the fear in their faces, the uncertainty, and she felt a fierce, protective anger rise up inside her. "We will find a way," she said firmly. "We are not giving up." Xander looked at her, and she saw the despair in his eyes begin to give way to something else, something that looked like hope. "How? I do not know yet," she admitted, "but we will figure it out together." The next 3 months were the hardest Vara had ever experienced, and that was saying something given the life she had lived. Xander worked tirelessly to find a way to raise the money, writing letters to potential investors, selling off everything the estate could spare, negotiating with merchants and traders. Vara and the other workers did everything they could to help, taking on extra tasks, finding ways to cut costs without compromising the quality of their work. But as summer wore on and the deadline drew closer, it became clear that they were not going to make it. They had raised perhaps half of what was needed, but 10,000 crowns was a staggering sum, and there simply was not enough time. One evening in late summer, with less than 2 weeks left before the debt came due, Xander called a meeting in the barn. All the workers gathered, their faces grim, and he stood before them with a weariness that seemed to have aged him years. "I want to thank you all," he said, his voice heavy. "You have worked harder than anyone could have asked, and you have believed in what we were trying to build here. But I have to be honest with you. We are not going to make it. We do not have the money, and I do not see a way to get it in time. Westcott will take the estate, and I do not know what will happen after that." There was a long silence. Then Masha, the older orc woman, stepped forward. "What about the land?" she asked. "Could we sell part of the estate, keep the main house and the fields we need, and sell the rest?" Xander shook his head. "I have already tried. Westcott has made sure that no one in the valley will buy from me. And even if I could find a buyer, there is not enough time to complete the transaction." Torrin spoke next, his deep voice steady. "Then we fight. We refuse to leave. Let Westcott try to force us out." "That will only make things worse," Xander said. "And I will not ask you to risk your safety for this." Vara had been standing at the back of the group, silent and listening, but now she stepped forward. "There is another option," she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Xander's eyes met hers, and she saw the question in them. "What option?" he asked. She took a breath, steeling herself. "Me, I can go back." The barn erupted in protest, voices overlapping, but Xander held up his hand for silence. "What do you mean, go back?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I can sell myself back into a contract," Vara said, forcing the words out. "Not to Grant, but to someone who will pay enough to cover the debt. There are labor holders who would pay a premium for an orc who is known to be a hard worker. I could negotiate a contract, take the money and give it to you. It would save the estate." "No," Xander said, and his voice was like iron. "Absolutely not." "It is the only way," Vara said, and she hated how calm her voice sounded when inside she was screaming. "You freed me, Xander. You gave me a choice. Now I am choosing to do this, to save what we have built." "You are choosing to throw away your freedom," Xander said, and she saw the anguish in his eyes. "You are choosing to go back to bondage. How is that a choice?" "Because it is mine to make," she said, stepping closer to him. "You taught me that. You taught me that my choices matter, that I have a say in my own life, and I am choosing this. Not because I want to, but because it is the right thing to do." He stared at her, and she saw the moment when he realized she was serious, when he understood that she was willing to sacrifice everything to save the estate and the people who depended on it. His face crumpled and he reached for her, pulling her into his arms. "I cannot let you do this," he whispered against her hair. "I cannot." She held him tightly, feeling his heart pounding against her chest. "You do not get to make that choice for me," she said gently. "I am not asking for permission. I am telling you what I am going to do." He pulled back, looking at her with tears in his eyes. "There has to be another way. If there is, we have not found it," she said, "and we are running out of time." The next few days were a blur. Vara reached out to a labor holder in a neighboring region, a woman named Gretch, who had a reputation for paying well and treating her bonded workers with a measure of decency. The negotiation was brutal. Vara made it clear that she was worth a premium, that she was experienced and strong and reliable, and Gretch eventually agreed to a contract price of 12,000 crowns, more than enough to cover the debt and leave a small cushion for the estate. Xander tried everything he could to stop it. He argued with Vara, pleaded with her, searched desperately for another solution. But as the deadline drew closer and no other option appeared, he finally, reluctantly, accepted that she was going to do this. The night before the contract was to be signed, Vara found him sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the fields. She sat beside him, and they were silent for a long time. "I love you," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I should have said it before. I should have told you every day. I love you, and I cannot stand the thought of you going back to that life." "I love you too," she said, and the words felt like both a gift and a wound. "But this is not forever. Gretchen's contracts are usually 10 years. I can survive 10 years, and when it is over I will come back. If you will still have me." "If I will still have you," he repeated, and there was something almost like anger in his voice. "Vara, I will wait for you as long as it takes. I will spend every day of those 10 years working to buy you back, to free you again. I swear it." She took his hand, holding it tightly. "I know. But for now we have to do this. We have to save what we have built." He nodded, and they sat together in the darkness, holding each other until the sun began to rise. The morning of the contract signing, Vara woke early and dressed in her best clothes, a simple but clean outfit that Marta had helped her put together. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked stronger, more confident, more alive than she had ever looked before. And in a few hours, she would sign away that life and go back to bondage. She went downstairs to find Xander waiting for her in the kitchen. He looked terrible, his face drawn and pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But when he saw her, he stood and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You do not have to do this," he said one last time. "We can find another way." She shook her head. "There is no other way, and I am ready." He pulled her close, holding her as though he could keep her safe through sheer force of will. "I will come for you," he whispered. "I promise. I will do whatever it takes to bring you home." "I know," she said, and she believed him. They rode together to the meeting place, a small inn on the edge of the valley, where Gretchen was waiting with her lawyers and the contract. Vara signed the papers with a hand that did not tremble, and Gretchen handed over a promissory note for the full 12,000 crowns, payable immediately to Xander Carrick. "Take care of her," Xander said to Gretchen, his voice low and dangerous. "If anything happens to her, if she is mistreated in any way, I will come for you. You understand?" Gretchen raised an eyebrow but nodded. "She will be treated fairly. I do not mistreat my workers. It is bad for business." Xander turned to Vara, and she saw the anguish in his eyes. "I love you," he said. "Do not forget that." "I will not," she promised, "and I will come back, I swear it." He kissed her then, a desperate, fierce kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow, and then Gretchen's men were leading her away, and Xander was standing alone in the yard of the inn, watching her go. But the story did not end there. Because as Vara was being led to the wagon that would take her to Gretchen's holding, a rider came thundering into the yard, his horse lathered and blowing. He was a young man, barely more than a boy, and he was waving a piece of paper in his hand. "Master Carrick," he shouted, leaping from his horse. "Master Carrick, wait," Xander turned, his face a mask of confusion. "What is it?" The boy skidded to a halt in front of him, gasping for breath. "I came from the capital. Your uncle, he had an account there, a bank account that no one knew about. The bank found it when they were going through old records, and they sent me to find you. There is money, sir. A lot of money. More than enough to cover the debt." Xander stared at him, and for a moment he did not seem to understand the words. Then he grabbed the paper from the boy's hand and read it, his eyes widening. 30,000 crowns, he whispered. He had 30,000 crowns in an account, and he never touched it. He looked up at Vara, and she saw the wild hope in his eyes. "Stop," he said to Gretchen's men. "Stop. The contract is void. I am buying her back." Gretch stepped forward, her expression hard. "The contract has been signed. The money has changed hands." "Then I will buy it out," Xander said, his voice fierce. "Right now, name your price." Gretch studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. 15,000 crowns. That is what it will cost to buy out a contract that was signed less than an hour ago. Xander did not hesitate. "Done. I will have the money to you by the end of the day." Gretch nodded, and her men released Vara. She stood frozen, unable to quite believe what was happening as Xander crossed the yard to her and pulled her into his arms. "You are free," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are free, and you are mine, and I am never letting you go again." She held him tightly, tears streaming down her face, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, standing together in the morning sun. The debt to Westcott was paid in full by the end of the week, and Xander used the remaining money to invest in the estate, to hire more workers, to buy better equipment. The estate flourished over the next year, becoming known throughout the region as a place where people were treated fairly and with respect. Other landowners began to take notice, and slowly, cautiously, the culture of exploitation that had dominated the valley began to shift. But the most important change happened quietly, without fanfare. In the spring, a year after Vara had nearly signed herself back into bondage, Xander asked her to marry him. Not with grand gestures or speeches, but simply in the middle of a field, with the sun setting behind them and the smell of freshly turned earth in the air. "Will you marry me?" he asked, holding her hands in his. "Not because you owe me, not because you feel obligated, but because you want to build a life with me, because you love me as much as I love you." "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a promise, like a beginning. "Yes, I will." They were married in the barn, surrounded by the workers who had become their family, and the feast that followed lasted until dawn. It was a simple wedding, with no grand decorations or expensive gifts, but it was full of laughter and love and joy, and Vara could not imagine anything more perfect. Over the years that followed, the estate continued to grow and thrive. Xander kept his promise to free all the bonded workers in the valley, working tirelessly to buy out contracts and offer people the choice he had given Vara. It was slow, difficult work, and there were setbacks and failures along the way, but he never gave up. And Vara was beside him every step of the way, his partner in every sense of the word. They had children eventually, 3 of them. A boy they named Henrik, who had his father's quiet determination and his mother's fierce loyalty. A girl they named Willa, who was bold and curious and unafraid of anything. And another boy they named Pax, who was gentle and thoughtful and loved the land as much as his parents did. The estate became a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go, a place where people could work and live with dignity and respect. And every year, on the anniversary of the day Xander had torn up Vara's contract, they held a celebration, a bonfire where they burned the contracts of any workers who had been freed that year. It became a tradition, a symbol of the estate's commitment to freedom and fairness, and people came from all over the region to take part. One evening, many years after that first dawn when Xander had bought out Vara's contract, they stood together on the porch of the main house, watching the bonfire blaze in the distance. Their children were playing in the yard, their laughter ringing out in the warm summer air, and the fields stretched out around them, green and thriving. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Vara asked, leaning against Xander's side. "If you had not done what you did, if you had just let the system continue." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at this, at what we have built, and I know that I made the right choice, the only choice I could have made." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We made the right choice, together." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the bonfire and the people gathered around it, and Vara felt a contentment that went deeper than happiness, deeper than joy. It was the knowledge that she was free, that she was loved, that she had a place in the world where she belonged. And it was the knowledge that she had helped to build something good, something that would last long after she was gone. The fire crackled and danced, casting warm light over the gathered crowd, and somewhere in the distance, someone began to sing. Others joined in, their voices rising together in a song of freedom and hope, and Vara felt Xander's hand tighten around hers. "I love you," he said quietly, and she heard the same wonder in his voice that she felt in her own heart, the wonder that they had found each other, that they had built a life together against all odds. "I love you too," she said, and the words felt like a vow, like a promise that would never be broken. The bonfire burned late into the night, and when the last ember finally died, Vara and Xander walked back to the house together, their hands clasped, their hearts full. Behind them, the estate slept peacefully under the stars, a place of freedom and hope, a testament to the power of choosing what is right over what is easy. And in the morning, they would wake and begin again, working side by side to build a world where everyone had a choice, where everyone had a voice, where everyone was free. It was hard work, and it would never truly be finished, but it was work worth doing. And they would do it together, as they had always done, as they always would. The seasons turned, and the years passed, and the estate that had once been built on exploitation became a beacon of hope for all who knew its story. And at the heart of that story was a simple truth: that one person's choice to do what was right, to see another person's humanity and fight for their freedom, could change the world. Vara and Xander grew old together. Their children grew and had children of their own, and the estate continued to thrive. And when they finally passed, many years later, they were buried side by side in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley, their headstones simple and unadorned, bearing only their names and a single line. They chose freedom. It was enough. It was everything. The estate carried on after them, guided by their children and grandchildren, and the tradition of the bonfire continued, year after year, a reminder of what they had built and why it mattered. The valley changed, slowly but surely, as more landowners followed Xander's example and freed their bonded workers, as the culture of exploitation gave way to one of fairness and respect. And though Vara and Xander were gone, their legacy lived on in every person who chose freedom over profit, in every contract that was torn up and burned, in every worker who was given a choice and a voice. Their love had changed the world, not through grand gestures or heroic deeds, but through the quiet, steady work of choosing what was right, day after day, year after year. And that, in the end, was the greatest story of all.